Hi, folks. You're with Tassus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about nationalism and how the nation state came about, or some of the major contributing factors, and as a sort of a subset of that, talk about travel times to get from A to B. And just to sort of illustrate the relevance of travel times and reducing travel times, it could take for someone to get from one end of, say, the southern part of England to the northern part of England. It could take this is pre-trains and just using horse and cart and so on. It could take months to get to the poor quality roads. There's in the event that it rained, the roads would be impassable and this sort of thing. It was often quicker to circumnavigate the entire British island in a ship, in say the 1400s, 1500s, than it was to try and do it by foot. Typically be only one road anyway. Now the times obviously changed in terms of, or technology changed, which reduced travel times. But say the first fleet that went from Britain to Australia in 1788. It took them nearly 7 months. Now, they took a longer route and they re-victualled at Rio and then took the favourable winds across. But it still took near 7 months. Even if the winds were quite favourable, they would take 4 months to get from England to Sydney, Australia. This is using sailing ships, of course. Now, this means they were sort of covering, ballpark 6 miles an hour. Give or take. So someone walking at a brisk walking pace could sort of do that, or pretty close. So they were effectively going at, say, a fit person's brisk walking pace. That was the speed that they'd be going at. If the weather was unfavourable, if the winds were poor, or they left at the wrong time of year when the winds were less than optimal, it could take longer again. And they could be down as little as 3 miles an hour at travelling speed. Now, the changed a little bit, say the clippers, which had a higher proportion of sails to total ship mass. They could travel in a shorter time. But today, using modern ship technology and assuming a reasonably sort of direct route, it takes a little bit less than 6 weeks to make it from England to Australia. So what would take even on a good wind and good passage 14 weeks, now it takes 6 weeks. But of course now it's automated. But now there are ships that can do that quicker, but they're quicker than that, but they wouldn't necessarily be carrying a large cargo load or something like that. So travel times make a huge difference in communicating with people. The travellers around rural areas in Europe would visit a stop at a village and say, well, King John or King whoever, King Wilhelm or something like that, is now on the throne, has been for 10 years. The people in the village wouldn't know that. Because they were in an outer village, there was no administrative structure. It was a lot of time and effort to get out there. Because travelling was so difficult, they just had pretty much a self-contained local community, and it was rare that people came by. So there could be a change in government, or there could be a major military conflict that would cause a change in government. But these people were completely oblivious in the villages. They had no idea, nor would it really affect them one way or another. It's hardly relevant to their day-to-day lives. But as roads improved and transport improved and communication improved and so on, then these people were getting information more regularly. Government officials were visiting them, and particularly where in languages were involved, there was a language used for the law. Now, it might have been Latin sort of in the earlier days, but as people became literate, particularly around reading the Bible, and particularly with the Protestants, the idea of communicating directly with God, and thus every citizen being required to read the Bible so they can worship God directly. Once literacy started to increase widely and with the legal language, this tended to bring people together. And as Latin was bypassed, the language within the territories controlled by the French king were French. So this brought everyone into the same language in the same civis, if you like, wider civis that the king was governing or responsible for, the king's domain. And this would be particularly in the area of, say, tax collecting and troop levying and things like that as time went on. So this brought the idea of the race of people, so the Franks or the French, and then with the same language, because they were required to speak the same language in order to, particularly the legal language being applied, even though there were many regional dialects in the earlier times. And so this brought the one racial group and one language together and one legal system together. Now, once those three fused, whether it be in the majority or an aggregation, then that's where the nation state came from. The fact there was commerce and so on inside those domains, but the king had no power, the government no power to tax citizens outside of that area. So that's how it became, a self-contained unit. Now, there were people in sort of the in-between areas. So if you look at the border areas, say, between France and Germany as a case in point, there's a lot of people along that border area that speak French and German. And traditionally, they would have done business with people all around them, whether the border was on this side or that side, or they lived on this or that side of the border. But as travelling improved and communications improved, and the language became more homogenous, then it was easier to do business with people that spoke your language, were within the same area. And given that you had to pay taxes and so on within a particular geographical boundary, then it became more sensible to do business within that boundary. Now, when you look at, say, Switzerland today, and Switzerland had the same border for a long time now, they have, as in hundreds of years, they have three languages or four languages really spoken there. And it surprised me when I visited Switzerland how many people could speak at least three languages, mostly four. So French, German, Italian, and of course English. So I was quite impressed by that, and they spoke it well. Not that they spoke one language and a few words in the others. I mean, they spoke it well, so I could converse in English and talking to people there. If there was French and German and Italian people, and say myself in the room, and I speak German, but it's not very good, or not good enough to talk at that sort of advanced college level. These people can speak all these languages well enough that it could easily be a first language. Each one of them could be a first language. So that's very impressive. But that was how Switzerland sort of did business. They're surrounded by much bigger neighbours who speak different languages, and they really had to be proficient in that. And Switzerland, of course, is a very rich country, and justifiably so. They're an industrious people, and they've fitted very well into that sort of neutral financial services and so on area there. But this is sort of how I think the nation state came about. The idea that as soon as nationalism mentioned, people's more immediate response is Hitler. No, it had nothing to do with that. It was around hundreds and hundreds of years before Hitler. If you look at when people really started referring to themselves as, say, English, and you'll see it sort of happening. Sort of particularly around the latter part of Henry VIII's reign and going into Mary and Elizabeth, and that's when you really start to see people referring to themselves as English. Now, bear in mind that the English race is an amalgamation of the Gaelic folks that are there, the Danes and the Norwegians, and also the French Normans, and they came. So it's a big amalgamation. But the Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, and so on. So, but that all sort of melting pot, together there. They're all white, Christian, and so they came together to create what was called the English race, and that's when people started to see themselves as English. And around that same time, if not slightly earlier, there are people regarded themselves as French. There are people that there's a certain racial grouping that was around what today's Holland and say today Northern Belgium, and they regarded themselves as Dutch or Flemish. There were these various racial groupings around and they'd clustered in a certain area. They had their own domain or their own area, their own government, their own king, their own language, their own laws, and this sort of thing. So that's where the nation state came from. It wasn't some fascist Nazi thing. That's nonsense. Maybe you hear it, just dismiss it. It's absolute crap. So, but one of the main things that underwrote this was travel and communications. Now, the English were probably leaders in arranging and organising internal communications within England. So through the canal system, they had a very good system of supply ships going around. They had some very good deep water ports around, so they could sail in and around the island, delivering goods, picking up goods, trading from city to city. And as times reduced, travel times reduced through better roads, the canals, as I mentioned, and the sailing ships, then people were brought closer together. Instead of having a farmer that could really only sell goods in a local area, could now sell his farm produce, for example, 50 miles away, 100 miles away, which wasn't really feasible before. Either it was going to be too expensive or it took too long, and the fruit and vegetables would spoil on the way, that sort of thing. But with reduced travel times and better storage, these sorts of things, then that made a big difference to bringing people together in trade. Now, if you've got to pay certain taxes, why trade with another country? Even if the border's not that far away, you'd rather trade internally because you're going to have to pay taxes anyway, so you may as well profit from your customers internally and so on. So this is what brought people together, and the British were really first in that. Similarly, the British were first to start putting railways internally in there, and you could travel from the north of Scotland to London in the overnight train. Now the train wasn't going very fast; it was going somewhere between 15 and 20 miles an hour, but it went sort of around the clock, other than stopping for water. It was a steam train, stopping for water and coal or wood or something like that. But it could get you to London the next day. That was unheard of. That was absolutely unheard of. It was considered to be an incredible revolution. Same as getting from London to, say, New York in the clipper ships. Could do that in under 3 weeks. So that was considered absolutely revolutionary before the steamship came along. So bringing reducing communication times is also and did also play an incredible role. And given that the England or Britain, the English were among the first people to discover nationalism and to perceive a national identity, then communications and reduced travel times, these sorts of things, played an absolutely pivotal role in that. In as much, people get daily newspapers on what's happening, all this sort of thing in one language. So they have a common language, common identity, and they can all do business with their neighbours, or even with cities that are 100 miles away, hundreds of miles away. You can get farm produce from Scotland and have it delivered to London the next day. These things brought the whole island together and created or led to or contributed to that national identity. And I've noticed there's a few videos around sort of looking at nationalism in some quite esoteric sense rather than the practical reality of things. Same language, same law, same people, same taxes, that sort of thing. That brings people together, and communications and things in common create a national identity, such as national newspapers and all that sort of stuff. So that was where I believe nationalism nationalism came from, or certainly a very key component of it. And you see the same thing, say, in Germany and Italy. Germany didn't federate as a nation until I think it was 1871. So in the overall scheme of things, that's quite late. And some of and it was an interesting amalgamation because the north of Germany was primarily Protestant, whereas the south, Bavaria, was primarily Catholic. And often Bavaria and some of these states would ally themselves with say, France or with the Austro-Hungarians or something like that against the Prussians, against their own kinsmen. But the Germans were, as soon as the railway network started to go in earnest, and you could travel from one bit of Germany to other in a day, then that was a decisive change. And it was around at that time when those big railway networks are being laid down, that's when suddenly all the Germanic states around in what later became Greater Germany, they all decided to federate and get together. And again, the farm produce from Bavaria could be shipped several hundred miles away to Berlin the next day, and so they could have customers all around Germany on getting around on that rail network. So it was cheap, reliable, fast transport, and that's what brought Germany together. The same thing really in Italy. As soon as the railway started to get laid down, Italy federated as well, even though it was effectively two nations, the south and the north. The north was quite sort of Germanic in many ways, if you like, and even today, northern Italy's got some of the world technology leaders in aerospace and mechanical engineering and so on. So there's the north and the effectively or the more agrarian south. But as soon as those railways went in, that was part of the basis for federation, which Italy, I think, federated in 1868, 1869, off the top of my head. So it wasn't a nation before then. So those states that were able to have effective internal communications and travels, Britain or England, France, they're the ones that had these pronounced national identities, and again, communications and travel were very much part of that. So that's my take on that. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.